Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder when I head out for a walk and deliver an episode to you while I stroll around. I'm Brendan Riley. Well, good morning, listeners. It is 5:45 in the morning here in suburban Chicago. I guess general anxiety or the world around us woke me up early, and so I've been doing a bit of work, but I felt like stretching my legs. So I thought I'd take my walk early this morning when I have very little chance of encountering other people, which is the way we're supposed to do it. So I hope that you are holding up, staying safe and healthy, and that this podcast brings you a little bit of pleasure as you're making your way through these difficult times. So today, I thought I would talk about drafting games. I've had a weird experience with drafting games lately. Namely, I bought a bunch of them by accident. I mean, not accident, not like I slipped and fell and bought some games. But rather, I had multiple games that I bought sort of listening to recommendations or reading a bit about them, looking at their ratings on BoardGameGeek, but not spending a lot of time reading about how the game works and then discovering that they were drafting games. Two in particular, Paper Tales and Letterpress, both turn out to be drafting games, and I did not realize. I thought Paper Tales was a tableau building game, which it is, but it's drafting is the main mechanism there. I thought it was deck building. Somewhere in there between listening reviews and things, I got it confused in my head. So it's strange to discover it was drafting and then discover another game was drafting as well. And Isle of Cats, which is a tile laying game, also turns out to be have drafting as a major component. And this got me thinking about how this mechanism is used. I looked back over the history of the 225 episodes we've done so far. This is 225, by the way. And I could not find anywhere I talked about drafting as the central mechanism, so I thought I would do that today. I've done a few episodes over the course of the show in which I focus on a mechanism and talk about it, so that's what we're doing. So I thought I'll start with a brief explanation of what drafting is and talk about some pros and cons of it as a gameplay mechanism, as an experience, and then we'll talk about a couple of games that I like that use that mechanism. So drafting, sometimes called pick and pass, is a method of selecting things for a player in a game, usually cards, but sometimes tiles, in which each player gets their own selection from a group, and then the next player gets to make a selection from that group as well, and then the next player as well. So each time you choose something, not only are you choosing what you get, but you are, by exclusion, choosing what other people don't get. Now, most of the time that drafting is used these days, it's used as part of a way to select cards. Usually, I would say, is the most common way. Like I said, I've seen it a few times in use of tiles. And often it's used as where everybody is doing the drafting at the same time. So there might be multiple pools of cards or multiple pools of tiles, and each person is picking something and then handing it on to the next. Now there is another mode of drafting, usually used with dice drafting. And in that one, there's usually only one pool of things, something like Sagrada or Azul or Coimbra. In those cases, there is a small pool of dice available, and each person takes turns picking out of it, but there's just the one pool. That's not the mechanism I'm talking about today. I haven't looked at the BoardGameGeek setup. I don't know if there's a distinction in those mechanisms between one pool drafting and multiple pool drafting, but it's the latter that I'm talking about today. So the base example of that, one that is easy to play if you haven't, and would be Sushi Go. In Sushi Go, everybody gets a hand of cards. You all pick up the hand of cards. You take one card out of that hand, and then you give the rest of the cards to the next player. You receive a bunch of cards from the previous the player to your, so say you're passing to the left, you give the cards that you didn't take to the player on your left. Meanwhile, the player on your right gives you the cards they didn't take. Then you pick one from that group and you pass it along. You do that until the hand runs out. That's the kind of drafting I'm talking about today. Like I said, wow, the birds are loud this morning. There is this other kind of drafting, but that's not really the subject. So, what are some pros of this sort of drafting? I think the biggest pro is that it introduces interesting decisions into a hand of cards. Most traditional games, and frankly a lot of other games, when you get dealt a hand of cards, that is your hand of cards. And so you get the choices that come out of that. But if there's not a good mix of cards, or luck favors one player, there's not a lot you can do about that. In drafting, each card that you take out of the selection you have becomes an interesting choice, because not only are you thinking about whether that's a good fit for the cards you've taken, you're also thinking about whether the cards you're letting go help your opponents too much. An interesting side component, perhaps, is the question of whether you're drafting visibly or invisibly. Some games, when you draft the different cards, you put them face up on the table, which gives your opponents some idea of what you've been taking and lets them plan based on your choices. Other games have you drafting secretly, and then nobody gets to see what you've taken until the end of the round, except insofar as they know what you had access to based on the cards they passed your way. Each of these has its own benefits and drawbacks. The second thing, I think I sort of already mentioned this, but the second thing that drafting does really well is that it helps to mitigate the random luck, where you just get a bad hand of cards and now you've lost the round. Now, some games, that's fine, that's how they work, and over time, randomness evens out. If you're looking at something like bridge, big part of bridge is reading the randomness that you get and learning to deal with it well. But in a lot of designer games, people complain about somebody getting the card that's perfect for their machine, or a handful of cards or whatever. And drafting allows the players to, in some ways, modulate that luck factor by choosing the cards themselves. Finally, I think I've already mentioned this as well, but drafting really encourages player interaction. It encourages you to watch what the other players are doing and be thinking about what they're doing when you are drafting. If you aren't doing that, then often you end up giving your opponent a card that really helps them. And if you have a couple people in a row who aren't keeping an eye on the table, sometimes that can cause a lot of trouble. So, it's funny, I like drafting games generally quite a bit. But my con list is 5 bullet points instead of the 3 on the pros list. I'm not sure what that tells us about the drafting mechanism. I said that the drafting mechanism is a way to mitigate randomness. I would say the alternate read of that is that it's a cheap dodge for randomness. That I've certainly heard it used in various discussions among more acerbic game reviewers than I, that card drafting seems to be a sort of band-aid for a game where the cards are misbalanced enough, or the gameplay is misbalanced enough, that if you get dealt a hand of cards, you're going to win or lose based on that hand. So let's just do some drafting in there to mitigate that randomness, but also just, avoid solving the problem at the heart of our game. And instead we'll draft cards. And then if you get a bad set of cards, well, you should have drafted better. That kind of attitude would then also exacerbate the next, I guess, 3. 1, 2, 3. Yeah. 3 bullet points. I only had 4, not 5. Which is that drafting exacerbates some problems rather than minimizing them. First off, it's still luck of the draw. If you have one card that's really important for your machine, your engine, whatever it is you're doing in the drafting game, and you get dealt that card right away, or someone else gets dealt it and takes it just to mess with you, that's still luck of the draw, right? So people who complain about the role of randomness in a game, if the game isn't sufficiently balanced to allow for that randomness, drafting does not solve that problem. It just moves the problem around or hides it, perhaps. Drafting also can make for unpleasant interactions. You know, there are a lot of people, and I would generally consider myself a Care Bear player, who prefer to build their own things rather than tearing down other people's things. And when you're doing a drafting game, particularly one that involves taking things that add to your, say, tableau or engine, then you're often faced with a choice, as I've mentioned here, of taking a thing that's good for you or taking something that's bad for, or taking something that's really good for someone else. And you have to decide which way you want to lean. This can sometimes cause bad feelings enough that in the game community we call that hate drafting, right? Drafting a thing you don't want just because you know it would be very good for someone else. And there are some games that really require this as part of the strategy. Which leads to my last point regarding drafting, before I get into some examples, which is, as much as drafting helps eliminate randomness, it also heavily favors experienced players. When you draft, you are supposed to be making choices with each hand of cards you get, or each slightly diminishing hand of cards you get, about which cards you're going to take. If this is a game with high complexity, those choices are pretty limited for somebody who doesn't know the game yet. If it's your first play, you don't know the interactions, you don't know which cards are good or not, you don't know which ones are situationally good versus universally good, and often you end up just kind of blindly picking. This can be exacerbated if the game is long, because every time you get past a new hand of cards, you have to then review all the cards before you can pick one. Which is why if you're ever sitting down to play Terraforming Mars and there's a new player at the table, do not allow the people running the table to use drafting. It won't be fair to the new player, and it'll take forever. So I think for me the biggest downside of drafting is that it heavily favors experience in the players. I think it gives experienced players a significant advantage that isn't earned by skill. It's just earned by familiarity. And generally, I'm going to say, if you have an advantage in a game just because you're familiar with it, but it doesn't really take a lot of skill to acquire that advantage, that's not the best design. It's almost unavoidable, but not the best idea. So what are some drafting games? Got a bunch that I can think of. There are some games that operate sort of purely as drafting games, and then other games that shift into other places as well. But a lot of games that use drafting have it as a central mechanism. If you're interested in trying this, this sounds entirely unfamiliar, which I suspect is unlikely given the audience that listens to this podcast, but maybe. You might want to try a game called Sushi Go. Sushi Go is a pretty light, family-friendly game from Phil Walker Harding, the designer who made Imhotep and Baron Park. In it, you are assembling a lunch at a sushi counter using they call it pick and pass method, or drafting, where you're going to hand cards around from one person to the next and take the things that you want to eat. It's a set collection game as well. That's how you score points. So you're trying to assemble different sets of sushi, which will score you points as you assemble them. I've explained the whole game, really. I mean, there's some different scoring conditions, but it's relatively easy, and it's entirely built around this one mechanism, which makes it a great introduction if someone's never played that before. If you're looking toward teaching them a more complex game that involves drafting, you could use Sushi Go to teach the drafting part and have fun doing it as well. It's a game I've played many times. So that's Sushi Go. A couple more complex games that revolve heavily around drafting are things like Seven Wonders, which is an Antoine Bauza design of strong prominence, in which you're trying to assemble a civilization using drafting. You get a hand of cards, you take a card, you pass it along, take another card. Once you've taken 6 of the 7 cards that you originally started with, the last one goes in the middle, unplayed. You know, one of the nice things about Seven Wonders is there's all these different, like Sushi Go, there's all these different ways that you assemble things and score things. You have to build up resources as well as point scoring things. And again, it's a game that rewards experience. I mean, Seven Wonders is the classic example. It rewards experience so heavily that I really strongly remind people when I teach it, watch out for science. Science is one of those things that in small doses scores just a few points. It's not all that exceptional. But if you let one person kind of run away with science, they can win the whole game just with science. It's very powerful in large numbers. And it's interesting to see which groups heed that advice and which ones don't. Because often I then try for science just to see if they were paying attention. And sometimes it goes their way. Sometimes it does not. So that's Seven Wonders, a pretty strong drafting game. A more recent addition to the gaming field, It's a Wonderful World, feels like Seven Wonders revised. In It's a Wonderful World, like Seven Wonders, you are building a civilization using drafting. You're getting a hand of cards, you take one, you pass it along. It's a Wonderful World iterates on the idea of Seven Wonders a little bit in a couple ways. First, it does not have you play the cards when you draft them. It just has you make a pile of cards that you're drafting. And then after everyone has drafted, then you decide which cards you want to play and which cards you want to discard to get resources. And the discarding to get resources is really interesting because you won't have enough resources to play all the cards you get. You have to discard some. And every card has the option of either being resources or being a card that you're trying to build. The game also has a step-by-step progression that allows you to build a thing and then immediately use it to get more stuff. So a really nice engine building element there. Lovely art as well. So I would say It's a Wonderful World is a nice twist if you're looking for something newer than Seven Wonders or with a different theme. It's more of a sci-fi theme. The last purely drafting game, Paper Tales is another one I've mentioned recently, which is sort of like a boiled down Seven Wonders type game with lots of interactions between the cards. Not probably as good as either Seven Wonders or It's a Wonderful World for my money, but really interesting and tight. I've only played it once at this point, so it may be, in fact, deeper than I'm mentioning or not quite as deep. I will let you know later. The last game I'll mention with regard to this particular strategy is Between Two Cities. Between Two Cities is a drafting game, but instead of cards, you're getting tiles. And then you use the tiles to build a city, actually to build 2 cities. That one's pretty interesting because it's heavily involves player interaction because you really need to be watching what the 2 people to your right and left are doing with their cities so that you can have an idea of what they'll pull. You also can talk to them, but it's a weird semi-co-op because the person on your right you're working with to build one city, the person on your left you're working with to build another. And both of them, it's interesting. The game, you want both of your cities to be as good as they can be because you win by your score is the lower of your 2 cities. So if you build a city worth 50 points and one worth 55 points, the one worth 50 points is the one that you score. Aside from the purely drafting games, there are a number of other games that use drafting as an additional mechanism in a larger field, often to mitigate card luck. The 2 strong examples, both of which I've mentioned today, are Isle of Cats, which does this for the resource gathering cards, and Terraforming Mars, which Terraforming Mars is a card-driven game. You do all kinds of stuff by drawing cards. There are other things you can do as well, but the cards that you play are a significant, if not crucial part of how you win the game. And generally you are going to draft there. One game that does not use drafting that I feel like could, but probably shouldn't, is Wingspan. Wingspan, you start with 5 cards, and you pay to keep each card that you want to keep. So you start with 5, and you get 5 food of different types, and you have to pay 1 food for each card you keep before you start the game. Similar to Terraforming Mars, we have to pay for each card you keep. In fact, Isle of Cats does that as well. Maybe this is the new evolution in card drafting games, is you draft and then have to pay to keep the cards that you draft, which actually rewards hate drafting, because you take a card you don't want that you know someone else will, and then you just throw it away. You don't have to pay for it. Yeah, like I said, Terraforming Mars, Isle of Cats. These are games where the drafting is a way to mitigate the dealing of cards, and then you use the cards that you've drafted to do other things. Which I think actually works out okay. I am not on the side of people who think that's lazy game design. I think that using cards to distribute things randomly is great, and drafting is an excellent way to mitigate the randomness of that. I think that the choices you get to make in drafting are pretty strong. I will say there was a really interesting argument over on the Terraforming Mars. Maybe it was on Facebook. It was on Facebook, actually, about Terraforming Mars. One person was sort of doing the I make an outrageous claim, prove me wrong, or convince me otherwise stance. But they were arguing that Terraforming Mars is better without drafting, inherently and always. And their argument was basically that Terraforming Mars should be about the tactical response to the cards that you get. And that if you're good at the game, you can win whether or not you get good cards. Like getting really good cards is not the thing that makes you win at Terraforming Mars. And there's something to be said for that. There's something to be said for switching. That said, I think for me the pleasure of Terraforming Mars is building those interesting machines that feed one card off after the next. And that's less effective if you just get dealt cards. You know, if you build a machine that relies on space cards, and then starting in round 4, you never get another space card, well, that's not fun. At least in drafting, if you're not getting other space cards, it's because people are taking them, which maybe feels bad. I don't know. So I'm curious, do you enjoy drafting games? Which ones do you like? Pop over to Board Game Geek Guild 3269 and let me know if I've missed any, or if the drafting games I've mentioned are among your favorites, and why. How do you come down on the side of whether drafting is strong or weak? Is it a nice addition to a game, or do you find it to be burdensome? Is the extra length that it usually adds to a game worth the effort? I'd be intrigued to know what you think. You can tell me that over at Board Game Geek in Guild 3269. You can also reach out to me, Brendan, at Rattlebox Games, or on Twitter, Rattlebox Games, or in lots of online places as Wombat929, most significantly Board Game Geek. Well, I hope you've enjoyed our walk today. I had a pleasant time, and the sun is coming up, and I need to get back inside. So until next time, thanks for joining me. I hope your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.